Morning, AP Eagles. Happy Friday. We made it to the end of another week. I got a bunch of important stuff to fill you guys in on, including going over the packet for the week and getting you guys some additional information to finish that off so that you guys can complete your short answer questions. Your learning target short answer questions are due tonight at midnight. Guys, please make sure that you are getting those in on time. We are continuing to grade material and update our grade books and all that kind of stuff. In fact, you guys will be getting your third quarter report cards probably sent home this weekend, so be looking for those in the mail. I wanted to start though with some really important stuff. The AP College Board had a video conference last night for about an hour answering questions about the modified AP exam for you guys. So we are on for the AP exam. I'm not going to fill your heads with a ton of information right now, but I'm going to give you guys some of the big highlights from that meeting that they had last night. Your AP US History exam will take place on May 15th, Friday, May 15th at 2 p.m. Okay? It will be an online exam, 45 minutes long, and there will only be one part of the test. This is kind of the crazy part, right? They got rid of the multiple choice, they got rid of the short answer question, they got rid of the LEQ. You guys, in 45 minutes, using an electronic device, whether that's a laptop, a desktop, a tablet, or your cell phone, will be in that 45 minutes writing a DBQ essay, not on 7 documents, but on 5 documents. Okay, they cut out a couple of the documents to shorten the amount of time that it will take to complete it. So 45 minutes for that. Now, the way that it's scheduled right now, you guys would actually be in school for this, right? Because we're supposed to head back to school on April 20th. All these things, again, as we talked about before, it's a very fluid situation, so things are changing all the time. We will see whether or not we're in school on May 15th. Again, at this point, we're just planning for being there because that's what we know so far. We're supposed to be back on April 20th, in which case you guys would be taking the AP exam in school, probably using the school laptops, on May 15th at 2 p.m., completing that 5-document DBQ essay. Now, my understanding is they did modify the rubric a little bit. That's not details I'm going to get into right now. Again, any of the questions or concerns you guys have, they're being very thorough about this. It's going to be well set up. I'm hoping that you guys aren't freaking out about this. You guys are good DBQ essay writers, analyzing documents and writing those essays. You've proven that this year, so I think that this could actually work out really well for us. Okay, more information to come, but I just wanted to throw that out to you guys, kind of get that in your heads right now. May 15th, that's the big one, 45-minute online exam, DBQ essay with 5 documents. Okay, let's do a quick review though of the material that you guys covered this week. We already posted the one video earlier this week. This is just meant to kind of recap the last of the research that you guys have been doing in your Roaring 20s to the Crash note packet. So if you guys don't have those in front of you, you might want to grab that. And I just want to kind of quickly go over some of these final pieces of the packet where you guys should have been working Wednesday and yesterday, right? Wednesday started here at Cultural Changes. You guys worked through the next few pages, including the Scopes Monkey Trial, the Harlem Renaissance, and then America as Consumers. Yesterday, you guys were supposed to get into the causes of the Great Depression, stock market crash, Hoover's response, President Hoover's response to the Great Depression, and then also right up to the election of 1932. So let's just recap all that really fast. This won't take too long. Cultural changes. Hopefully you guys used the PowerPoint that was in the files section in Teams. Cultural changes during the 1920s. One of the big themes that we need to kind of wrap our heads around, because there's all these individual examples of changes that are taking place during the Roaring 20s, but the big theme of the Roaring 20s is that America has become a young and more modern society. So that's sort of a phrase you guys are going to hear me say a couple times here, is this idea of moving away from tradition to sort of a more modern and youthful America. The cultural changes that take place during this time period are sort of proof of that. Maybe one of your best examples is flappers, right? Women as flappers. We know that women gained the right to vote in the 19th Amendment in 1920. So going into the early 1920s, through the Roaring 20s, through that whole time period, women, sort of this new sense of liberation and rights and empowerment, and women are going to go out into society, and they're going to do some crazy things, right? They're going to wear short dresses, and they're going to get short haircuts, and they're going to listen and dance to music out in public, and they're going to go to bars, and they're going to drink, and they're going to smoke cigarettes, and be like, oh my God, all this crazy stuff. Things that we look at now and we think, well, that's not that crazy. But in the 1920s, women are really, again, being empowered by the 19th Amendment. And of course, there's a lot of, older Americans, more traditional Americans that see this and they think, oh my gosh, the world is ending. Look at these women and what they're doing. But flappers was really a sign of the times, and there's other things too. We talk about this idea of like a youth culture, that America sort of seemed like young and vibrant at this time. Remember that America economically is doing really well too, so people have extra money and they have extra time. So entertainment is becoming a really big thing. We have sports becoming really popular, baseball, and Babe Ruth, maybe the most famous baseball player of all time, right? Becoming like the American sports figure. Boxing was really, really popular with boxers like Jack Dempsey. So sports are becoming really popular. Music, this is the time period of the jazz age. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance in a second, but the jazz age and jazz music and the Charleston doing this dance. It's called the Charleston. So people are out and about, they're spending money. Entertainment is big at this time. Cities are booming. For the first time in American history, more people are going to live in urban areas than rural areas. This is something that's been coming for a long time. We've sort of seen that during the Gilded Age, people were moving, urbanization, moving into the cities. But it's during the 1920s that for the first time in our history, more people live in urban areas than in rural areas, which proves we've become more of an industrialized society than an agricultural society. Okay, so those are sort of your cultural changes. The Scopes monkey trial is a perfect example of these cultural changes. Now, hopefully you researched this. I'm just going to kind of quick recap. You got a science teacher in Tennessee named John Scopes, under a law that was passed in the state of Tennessee called the Butler Act. He's not allowed to teach about evolution and Charles Darwin's theories, and he does it anyway, and he breaks the law. Now, as a side note, total publicity stunt. This is very much like the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. He's knowingly going to do this. He wants to do this. He wants this to be known that he's going to break this law because he wants to challenge it. And goes on trial. William Jennings Bryan is the prosecuting attorney. So this becomes like this huge media circus. Evolution versus creationism, right, which comes from the Bible. Religion versus science, tradition versus modern. And it's really, the Scopes trial is really a sign of the times of the Roaring 20s, all this sort of cultural conflict that's taking, the old versus the new. Ultimately, Scopes is going to be convicted because he did break the law. He taught evolution. It was against the law under the Butler Act. Because he lost, he's going to be fined $100, and that's pretty much it. I mean, the punishment and the crime and all those kinds of things, it's almost not a huge deal, but what it stood for, the symbolism of it, and again, it's that idea of tradition versus modernization, of religion versus science, and so on, okay? It's a sign of the times. All right, the next part of the packet talked about the Harlem Renaissance. I'm sure this is something you guys have heard of before. Harlem Renaissance, sort of a celebration of African American culture. We know that during World War I, we had the Great Migration to the North. Many African Americans, for the first time, having that opportunity to leave the South, something that they didn't have after the Civil War. But now, after World War I, African American communities developing in urban areas of the North. And the Harlem Renaissance is what sort of comes out of that, a celebration of African American culture and heritage. And of course, you see these sort of famous African American artists, writers, musicians from the Jazz Age. You got Louis Armstrong,
authors like Langston Hughes, and you guys read some of the poetry. It's a little section of it down here in your note packet, you know. But during the Harlem Renaissance, you also have something called the Back to Africa movement. Famous African American known as Marcus Garvey. So if you don't have this, you're going to want to write this in here. Marcus Garvey promoted this idea of the Back to Africa movement. He promoted really what was known as black nationalism. The name of the movement is exactly what it was. What he was promoting was that African Americans, feeling like they would never really get a fair opportunity in the United States, you know, because of the difference between, you know, white and black and the racial divide, should head back to Africa, you know. And he actually purchased these steamships, and they were going to transport African Americans to Liberia. And it didn't end up ultimately panning out the way that it was supposed to. In fact, those ships never made it to Liberia. The business ultimately went bankrupt. He ended up being charged with fraud, I believe, and ended up in prison. But that's sort of regardless of the big thing that you guys need to understand is that this Harlem Renaissance, again, it's about African American pride in their culture and heritage, is sort of black nationalism that Marcus Garvey promoted. And the Harlem Renaissance is sort of another piece to that puzzle that we've been talking about as far as African American rights, from, you know, slavery all the way back to Jamestown, to you know, the abolitionist movement, to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. And we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and now we have this Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, and of course we know that the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And so it's all this sort of long, continuous story about rights for African Americans. We leave the cultural changes of the 1920s. Let's focus on the economy and kind of finish this off. The next portion of your notes, guys, was America as consumers. And again, hopefully you guys use the PowerPoint for this. Americans, were consumers during the 1920s. We were buyers, and we were buying more than ever. There's a lot of new consumer goods that are out at this time. The Model T is a perfect example of this, right? Everyone wanted to buy a Model T because Ford had democratized the automobile. He had made it available to all Americans at a price that seemed fair and that people could afford. What you need to know is that during the 1920s, there's this real economic boom, and people are buying. And because of that, businesses were soaring. And the problem that America ran into is that we became so fixated on the growth, you know, and dollar signs in our eyes, and let the good times roll. And people just got so into that they didn't see the underlying problems in the economy. It was really the farmers in the Midwest that started to experience it first. If you looked at the farmers during the 1920s, I think you could have gotten a sense that there was an economic sort of collapse, a moment that was in the future. But again, people didn't want to focus on that. That's not fun, you know, focusing on the farmer. No. Let's focus on urban areas. Let's focus on cities and growth and businesses and spending money and going to sporting events. And people just didn't want to see the problems that were sort of underlying. In the 1920s, the economy is growing, and stocks are going up, and businesses are making money. But then you guys got to the final part of your note packet, and that was the causes of the Great Depression. Now, just so you guys know, next week we're going to be getting into the Great Depression, presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. We're going to talk about his New Deal programs and all those kinds of things. But we got to start the Great Depression here, and hopefully you guys found this pretty easily. Big causes of the stock market crash. At this time, we have what is called a bull market. The stock market is soaring, okay? A bull market is when stocks are going up and people are buying, and this is really good. You want a bull market. The problem is there are some underlying issues, and the big ones, there's three of them, okay? So you guys are going to want to make sure that you write these down and that you understand these. If you don't, you're going to want to look them up a little bit more detail. First problem that led to the Great Depression and the stock market crash was something called overproduction. Okay, so write that in, overproduction. And basically, we were overproducing. Farmers, initially, food, were overproducing. And then businesses and factories were overproducing as well. remember, they were producing because the money was being made in the 1920s. Money was being spent. It was such an exciting time period. But ultimately, you have to balance that out, right? Something called supply and demand. And what businesses were doing is they were supplying so much, they were making so much. The demand ultimately was not there anymore by the end of the 1920s. Think about it this way. If I bought a toaster in 1925, do I need to keep buying toasters every couple months? No, I already have a toaster. Once people fill a demand that they have, the supply of those products, the business needs to shift and they need to decrease their supply. And businesses didn't do that. Farmers were overproducing crops. People weren't buying it anymore. Businesses, factories were overproducing consumer goods. People weren't buying as much of them anymore. So you have this imbalance in the supply and demand. And you guys know how that works. When the supply is too high, you have to decrease your prices just to try to get rid of those products, and then profits are dropping. So overproduction was an underlying issue. Over-speculation. Write that one in if you don't have it. Over-speculation. People looked at the stock market, they saw it going up, and they thought it would just never stop. All right, that's what over-speculation is. When you speculate, you are predicting. All right, and people predicted that the stock market was going to keep going. That's called over-speculation. That didn't happen. The stock market didn't keep going up. Stock market always goes in waves, and eventually it was going to come down. But people just didn't think that way. And because of over-speculation, you have your third cause of the Great Depression. And it's known by a couple names. Some people refer to it as margin buying, margin buying, or buying on credit. Because people over-speculated stocks and people wanted into the stock market so badly, people started buying stocks when they didn't have the money to actually buy it. They started buying it on credit or margin buying. So basically, I have $5, I want to buy this $100 stock. A stockbroker might say to me, hey, I'll get you the $100 stock. Give me your $5. I'll let you buy it without the other 95. We'll just call that your credit. We'll say, okay, you owe me the 95. And when the stock, that $100 stock, goes up, because that's what they thought would happen, eventually you'll sell that stock for $500. And you can pay me the 95 that you originally owed me, and then you get to keep whatever's left over. And that's what people did. They started buying stocks without actually having the money to buy them. And then all of a sudden, when stocks started to drop, and the value started to drop, those $100 stocks that were bought for $5, well, you can't sell them for $100 anymore. They're selling for $50 and $30 and $20, and people start panicking, and you have this panic selling. So people are trying to get out of the stock market as quickly as possible, and ultimately it was bought. These stocks were bought on money that didn't exist. It just creates a whole issue. And by the way, the banking system and our financial system in the United States, this is something that will be corrected coming up in the 1930s and 40s, that FDR is going to work with Congress to try to correct the issues that caused the stock market crash. All right, let's just finish it off then real quick. Stock market is going to crash in 1929. It's sort of a series of plummets in the stock market. It starts on a Thursday. 12.9 million stocks are going to be traded on a Thursday. People see this as sort of panic selling, like everyone's trying to get out of the stock market. And that ultimately will lead to what is known as Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. And that's sort of the day that people say, like, that's the day of the stock market crash. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. A series of just panics. People are panicked, and there's a run on banks, and there's a series of bank failures because banks loaned out all this money, all people's money, and then people showed up and said, I need all my money back, I'm panicking. And the banks don't have the money because they loaned it out to people. And now there's a series of bank failures, and these banks close down, and people never get their money, and they lose their life savings and lose their retirements. Businesses shut down, right? As the stock market crashes, businesses are going to go bankrupt, and people are going to lose their jobs. So unemployment skyrockets, and people can't pay their rent. And you guys know that, the Great Depression, you can sort of capture it in words, the problems that take place and the fear that's taking place during this time period. And the president at the time was President Hoover, and that's on the next page here. President Hoover, and it asks for his response to the Great Depression. Now, President Hoover was known as being an economic genius. So you'd think if you wanted a president in office during this time period, Hoover was sort of like the guy that you would want. But President Hoover's response to the Great Depression surprised a lot of people. First, President Hoover had been the head of the Food Administration during World War I, so he knew how to regulate food and how to get people what they needed. After World War I, he was the head of the American Relief Administration. This was the organization that provided food to countries in Europe, Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And Belgium is known for basically being saved by Hoover, that he was able to get them what they needed during this time period of crisis. So you look at this, wow, Hoover has a background in being able to deal with the basic needs of people during a time period of crisis. He's the perfect guy for the job. And Hoover comes out and basically tells the American people, like, okay, we're in this Great Depression. I have the solution. Wait. Patience, he talked about. And for the American people in a state of panic and chaos and fear for their lives and their well-beings and their basic needs, for the president to come out and say to them, just wait. It's just going to take patience. It'll correct itself. Now, as a side note, Hoover's not wrong. That's how the economy works. The economy goes in waves, and there's time periods where the economy is great, and then time periods where it shifts down, and it will go back up. Hoover wasn't wrong. It's just not what people wanted to hear during this time period. So people will start to criticize Hoover, and you guys know the names. The Hoovervilles are those shanty towns where people who lost their homes lived, when they had bums, homeless people sleeping on benches, and they covered themselves with newspapers. People started referring to those as Hoover blankets, homeless people covering themselves with newspapers. There's also this famous event during this time period that you might want to look up, so write this one in too. It's known as the Bonus Army, or the March on Washington. There were a bunch of veterans from World War I that had been promised a bonus. And that was supposed to be paid out not at this time. It was supposed to be paid out in the 1930s, but a bunch of these veterans marched on Washington. It was known as the Bonus Army, and they marched on Washington basically demanding their bonuses, their pay from World War I early. And Congress and Hoover told them, no, you're not getting your bonus now. You're not supposed to get it now. It's supposed to come later. You can't just demand it now. So this Bonus Army sets up shop right in the Washington, D.C. area, right outside of Congress, and they build the shanty towns and Hoovervilles there, and they just wait and they demand their money. And ultimately, the U.S. Army will be sent in to get rid of these veterans, and violence will break out, and veterans will be killed in this terrible, terrible event. And of course, for Hoover, it's a total nightmare, because what you ultimately have happening, think about this, guys, is current U.S. soldiers end up fighting and attacking U.S. veterans, ex-soldiers of the military. So think about these two sides fighting each other. It's just a total nightmare for the government. And it's a sign for people that Hoover is unfit for office, that he should not continue to be the president, that he hasn't done enough for America to help them deal with the Great Depression. And that's what will lead to the election of 1932. And you guys see the election map down here at the bottom. I mean, you want to talk about a landslide victory. People were done with Hoover. They wanted a new voice in there. Franklin Roosevelt's the guy that they're going to go with. Franklin Roosevelt is a guy that offered solutions to the Great Depression. It wasn't so much that he was going to be able to fix it immediately, but he was willing to offer people relief, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Okay? Hopefully that helped kind of recap the last 2 days of material for you guys. If you have any questions, email me, shoot me a chat on Teams, and don't forget about that AP exam. I'll get you guys more information, but keep in mind, May 15th, Friday, it's going to be a 2 o'clock online exam, 45 minutes long, and a 5-document DBQ essay. And we'll be doing a lot of work leading up to that, making sure you guys are ready to nail that. All right? You guys have a nice weekend. Again, let me know if you guys need anything, and we'll talk to you soon.